Hodgeman. And I lived in Dodge County in Beaver Dam from 1845 to my untimely death in 1899. But I came from Middlesex County, Massachusetts, right outside of Boston. Was born on November 25th, 1824. And as a young man over the years, until I was in my early 20s, I learned to become a cooper. You guys know what a cooper is? A cooper is a barrel maker. If you ever heard of a cooperage. Well, as you can imagine, as we got closer into the 1840s out east, there was a great demand for barrels everywhere you went, especially in the eastern coast. But at the time, here in Wisconsin, as we call it today, was still in what we call Michigan territory. And a lot of immigrants from the 1830s through the 1840s were coming into Wisconsin at that time. And Wisconsin was primarily still a wilderness, mostly at that time, especially in Dodge County. A lot of Native Americans around this area at that time. So my father, Ozza, who I learned to become a cooper from, at the age of 21, my father and I came out to Dodge County, Wisconsin, through the way of going through the upper Great Lakes down to Fort Howard, which was in Green Bay, and then over here to Dodge County. Now in 1845, Beaver Dam had only been here for about 3 years, established by Thomas Mackey and the Browers and some of the other early settlers. And if you came here as a young man or a woman and you had any kind of skill or trade, you could make a good living here. And there was always a need for coopers wherever you went, because people needed good tight water barrels, beer barrels, and because there were a lot of German immigrants in Wisconsin, right? A lot of German immigrants came to Dodge County at that time. And shortly after the 1840s, right around 1852, Dodge County has its first brewery, Farmer's Brewery. And later we have other breweries like Binzel and Ziegler and some of the other ones you might be familiar with. So at that time, there was a great demand for coopers. And at one time, Binzel Brewery was producing 12,000 barrels of beer a year. That's a lot of barrels to make. So we had a lot of work. So from 1845 to 1854, for 9 years, I worked as a cooper with my dad, saved up some money, lived at home, and finally, I had enough money where I decided to get my own farm. You guys all like ice cream? You ever go to Dairy Queen over here?
Oh yeah.
Well, my farm once existed over where Dairy Queen is and stretched all the way towards the lake, about 50 acres. And on that land were stands of timber as well, a lot of tamarack. So not only did I farm from 1854 to 1874 for 20 years, but in 1870, because of the large stands of timber I had, I also started milling and doing mill work and having a lumber yard on my farm. Well, after doing that for 4 years, I made quite a bit of money. As you can imagine, even in the 1870s, as Beaver Dam was growing from what it is today, there was a great demand for lumber of every kind to make, whatever you needed lumber for. So I became a man of means. And before that, though, I did it again. I forgot a very important piece of myself. In the 1860s, I became a Civil War soldier. And my brother Newell had migrated out to northern Michigan, and he called me up, sent me a letter, and said, I would like you to join the 7th Michigan Volunteers. And so we joined in 1861, a little after the war had already started. And at the Battle of Gettysburg, I was given a field commission as a lieutenant. And then I fought for 2 more years and came home. And this is me when I was a little bit younger, a little trimmer, beard's a little tighter. All right. All right. So after getting back to the mill business in 1874, after I decided to sell my mill and my farm, I went out to Colorado. Do you know why? Because I got the wanderlust. And my brother Newell, who also survived the Civil War, was out in Colorado Springs. And he had been sending me letters for months telling me about the grandeur of the Colorado Rockies and all the opportunity out there. Because in 1876, Colorado became a state. But I was out there until about 1874, so I witnessed not only Wisconsin becoming a state in 1848, but also witnessing Colorado becoming a state. But after being out in Colorado for about 3 years, I decided to come back. But while I was out there, I was learning how to become an accomplished furniture maker. And I had dabbled in this a little bit when I had my lumber yard out on my farm. And I came back, and on June 1st of 1877, I opened up one of the first furniture stores on Front Street. And at the time, I was also in direct competition with Mr. McKinstry and Mr. Yeoman. But I had a specialty. And Steve Hankis knows about this specialty. I made the finest bedroom sets in the county. And I also made the finest coffins in the county. And I also did some framing work. But coffins were in great demand. People were not living as long as they do now. So I developed a wonderful undertaking service in my property. And you know what? I just learned today that 122 years after my death, that the McKinstrys are still in business. Still in business as Wisconsin's oldest furniture store, family run. That's crazy. That's crazy. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Steve will escort you back.
I'm Shafer. I was laid here to rest in 1894.
Here's that little light you think you're going to need.
You have to believe me, I'm Bob Shafer. You can't read anything on the stone. So I am Bob Shafer, and I ran a repair shop here in Beaver. It was downtown next to the Clark House. The Clark House was downtown. It was known throughout the Midwest for its fine food and its fine accommodations. Unfortunately, it did burn down. But that was a good location for me. Now, some people were upset that I was next to the Clark House because it was such a nice establishment, and they say it was filled with junk. That wasn't junk, it was parts I needed for doing my repairs, and I knew where everything was in there. It was sort of full. I only had a few feet on my workbench to work, and for my chair and a wood stove, but there's always room for a few chairs there so that my buddies could come down and we could sort of talk about what was going on in the town, because that was important. But you know, it's interesting, they wrote a book called The History of Dodge County, and in that book it said that I was a happy fellow with a long white beard, but I had pardonable shiftlessness. Now, I'm not quite sure if I should be offended by that or not. I'm not sure what pardonable shiftlessness is. Now, across from the Clark House, there was another one, and that was the gentleman there. He went and he had a ring for horses behind the Clark House, and he trained horses. Actually, that was Mr. Height, and he had moved here from where he was in the hotel business out in Pennsylvania. But Wisconsin was an interesting state in one way, is that we like to start circuses, and they started in 1847 to 1900. We had 100 circuses start in the state. Now, some of them were just some people taking their horses that they taught tricks. Some of them, they had kids that did tumbling, and you know, they couldn't go to the Olympics then, so they'd start a circus, I guess. But then they'd have people doing juggling. And so he went and he had the trained horses. He had some kids in town that were good at acrobats. So he decided to start a circus. And they did that circus with George DeHaven, who had tried to start a circus earlier, but just couldn't quite succeed. And he had a menagerie, a wild wolf, some other animals that you don't see around, the moose and that. But I don't know if I'd call it that great of a menagerie. But the two of them went into business, and I have to apologize, but he was such a businessman. I have to look up what circuses he ran for the next 9 years. Because he started the first year, his partner, so they called it the George D. Haven United States Circus. Then it was the Hayton Chambers Palace Show and Menagerie. Then it was the Wooten and Height Empire City Circus. And finally, it was the Great Eastern Circus Museum and Menagerie. Now, in those 9 years, he bought out some other circuses, and so he did have some by the time, 9 years after he left here, he went and he actually had 2 zebras, 2 camels, those 5 or 6 lions, a tiger, and so, and 1 baby elephant. Now, he was quite the promoter, because if you'd look at his advertising, it'd say, a herd of elephants, and a herd of this. And I just told you how many. But one thing, he was great. They'd hold the circus, and they'd move out fast and get to the next town before word got out that, you know, he didn't have it wasn't quite as advertised. One good thing came out of his circus being closed, actually going out of business 9 years after it started here in Beaver Dam, is he went in Lebanon, Ohio was the last place he played, and that was where they had an auction, and the city of Cincinnati bought all of his wild animals, and they used them to start their zoo. But back to me, anytime you need anything fixed, come down to my repair shop. I can do it, even if it's just a bent rib on your umbrella.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
You can come in closer, I won't. Benner Thorpe here. Nice to meet you folks.
Nice to meet you.
It's kind of funny, you know, most of us kind of came to this area here straight from where we started out. Others, like me, kind of did a more meandering route to get here. But in the end, whether young or old, successful or destitute, we all in the end kind of arrived here in this hallowed ground here, all in the same place. So I came from Moulton, England, and I was born in 1816, a simple farmer. In 1840, I took Mary Ann Hutchinson as my bride, and we were blessed with 5 children. There was no land in England for us to own or to pass on to our children, and there wasn't much opportunity for them. So Mary Ann and I decided that let's make a success of ourselves in America. So we were, you know, no money, very little education. I was young and strong, and I wasn't afraid to hard labor, physical labor in that. So when we arrived in New York, I worked at a brick yard for 3 years and learned the ins and outs of the trade, and then moved my family. Then we moved to Watertown, Wisconsin, and there I kind of took any job I could. I was digging wells, I was lathing houses, and we arrived here in Beaver Dam the day before the 4th of July celebration in 1855. And here I drove a dray for 11 years until I kind of noticed and realized that there was a need for brick in this growing and booming town and that. So I started a brick making business. And that's how I made my success and made a comfortable life for my family. And even though it did take me a long time to arrive at that, but I stuck around here until my 90s and basked in that, but in the end, here's where we all end up. So that's a little story about Benner Thorpe.
Thank you.
Sick of each other, maybe is the nicest way I can put it. So to have new bodies is always wonderful.
Right.
I marry Rowell, not the Rowells that had the money. So, we had a bakery, and I'll tell you about that in a minute, but I've got new people here, and that gives me maybe a chance to brag just a little bit, because you don't get many of those either. I want to read you what it says on a tombstone, because my husband and my son were gone before I was. This was put up by other family members. And it's so nice, and it makes me feel so good that I don't want to miss a single word of it or an opportunity to brag. It says, her life was one continuous love affair and charity. With everyone, she was tender, helpful, and kind to all. A true Aunt Mary. Now, isn't that just wonderful?
Yes.
That people thought that much of me, and I never thought I did that much for anybody. But back to my bakery, let me tell you about that. Well, my husband's bakery. He made absolutely the best gingerbread you can ever imagine. You could smell it for blocks, and he never had to do any advertising. All he had to do was make a batch of gingerbread. And Beaver Dam did have lots of activities way back in the day. And he would load up his wagon and the horse, and they would drive to the activity, whatever it was, and the smell of gingerbread would just roll out of the truck. He sold it as fast as he could dish it up. It was always gone. It was the best gingerbread in the world. When he died, we discovered he had never written down the recipe.
Oh, boy.
Even I didn't know it. Now, the other thing, so often, when we're talking about old Beaver Dam, we start talking about things and people wonder where that was. Well, I can tell you, our bakery was right across the street from the Clark House, which I bet tells none of you anything, other than the really good tour guide you got tonight. But I can tell you, I went down and I looked. Does the name Chili John's mean anything to anybody? That's where our bakery was. That's where our bakery was. Further down Front Street, where the American Bank is today, everybody knows where that is. There was a restaurant and a tavern, and they sold liquor and beer. And we ladies didn't think that was a necessary thing at all. And we got after a couple of places here, and then he heard we were coming. And by the time we got there, he was locked up, shuttered tight, gone. 3 weeks later, we reopened, and he had a restaurant, and they didn't even serve wine. We got the job done. Sometimes you just have to carry it. Thanks for coming to see us.
All right, I'm standing on my gravestone. It was a government-issued gravestone. That's because I was in the Civil War. It's kind of sinking in. This is a much newer one, but I was in the Civil War, enlisted in my 20s, and got home safely. But I was ill for many years after that because I got typhoid fever. A lot of people had it at that time, and it was from drinking bad water. So I was glad to get back to Beaver Dam and Dodge County. And interesting thing about it, though, in Dodge County at the time, is people were pretty split as far as was the Civil War a good thing or a bad thing. And there were people that were dealing with people in the South with businesses. In fact, there was a big cotton mill here that bought cotton from the South and had it hauled up and made cotton sheeting. So lots of people for the Civil War and against the Civil War right here in Beaver Dam. We had a famous abolitionist that spoke here, Frederick Douglass, and people were worried for his safety. And there were lots of fights. Our own Judge Sloan, who was very famous and became a senator for the state, and was even friends with Abraham Lincoln, presided over lots of court cases dealing with fighting about the Civil War. But I don't consider myself a hero just because I was in the war. I really look at my cousin Sam. He was quite the hero. he was an enlistment officer, and his job was to go to every house and knock on the door and find out if there was any able-bodied people there that could go off to the Civil War. Well, one of the houses he came to, knocked on the door, and 6 women came out, and they had rolling pins and broomsticks, and they chased him halfway to Fox Lake. He was the real hero. I'm just glad to be back here in Beaver Dam. Been lying in the spot for over 100 years. Beaver Dam, we got good clean water. So, thank you for visiting.
Thank you.
You kind of surprised me. Where are my manners? I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Lovilla Traver, and I'm buried here with my husband John, who was a carpenter, and also my 4-year-old son, dear sweet Louis. But I have other children as well. I have Jane, Charlie, the trickster, Mary, Adelbert, and my favorite, Frank. Perhaps you know Frank, I'm not sure. His name he goes by is Dr. F.A. Traver. He's a dentist. I'm so proud of him. Oh, a dentist. But I am so surprised that he survived into adulthood. The things boys will do in the 1870s. First of all, a circus came to town, as it usually does. It was about a little bit south of Mr. Booth's place on 500 North Center Street. And they connived with the circus manager to hire the elephant for circus passes to get in. So Mr. Booth had a well, and they went in there with their pails. They're going to water the elephant. Now, I don't know how many pails of water that they took over there to water an elephant. I don't know how much they drink, but I do know what happens when they're full. And that's what this elephant did. It raised up its trunk and it just sprayed those boys just like a fire hose. I am so glad that the elephant decided not to stomp them. Well, then boys will be boys. They like to go swimming. And around here, there's lots of places where you can go swimming. Drake's Mill Pond is one of them. That's where people go swimming now. Would they go swimming there? No. The other place would be Beaver Dam Lake, of course. Would they go swimming there? No. They went swimming on the 3rd Mill Pond down from the dam on Beaver Dam River near Cooper Street. That place is an absolute cesspool. People who have houses that line that river on Front Street and down, they just build their outhouses over the river. Exactly. Would you like to go swimming in that? No, I would not either. These boys, I can tell you. And then Mr. Hensler's meat market is right there too. And so as he slaughters the animals, the things that he doesn't want, where does he put that? Right in the river. And then there's Wade's Livery. And they shovel the manure right into the river. So that's where these boys like to swim, with the dead rats and the dead cats. And then, they, let's see. And then they decided that they wanted to practice their marksmanship. Okay? Now, who would give boys guns anyway? I don't know. But they are shooting the rats in the knotholes at Mr. Hensler's slaughterhouse there. Shooting. It's amazing that they didn't shoot each other. So I'm very thankful that my son is a dentist, but I think I'm more thankful that he lived through his boyhood. Thank you.
Thank you.
Evening. Thank you for stopping. My name is Elizabeth Hensler. And I'm buried here with my 8 of my babies. Albert, Augusta, Clarissa, Emma, George, Louis, Theodore, and one more who died after I had passed. My husband and I ran the Hensler Meat Market, which is on the southwest corner of our Front and Center Streets. The boys and my husband would get up early in the morning and they would drive out in the country and pick up prime beef, chicken, poultry, and pork. And they would take it to our meat processing place that was on the end of 3rd Street, right by the lake. And then when my husband passed, our son John took over the business. Now back in my time, downtown Beaver Dam looked quite different, of course, than what it does now. The stores all had planked sidewalks, which were an improvement over sinking in the mud when you're just walking there. And but they were slanted and they got quite wet and slippery when it rained. So permanent wood awnings were built over all the businesses on the north side of the building with hitching posts on, lined on both sides of Front Street. On Saturday, the area farmers, they would come, do their trading, and get their mail. The Indians who were camped in Dennings Woods, right down by Waterworks Park, they would come into town also. And one of them, a little 10-year-old boy, I suppose 10 years old is about like this, he was quite a marksman. And what he would do is he'd put a penny inside a forked stick, and then he would shoot it. And his aim was pretty good. He got it almost 80% of the time. And an enthusiastic gambling spirit ensued because they'd bet on whether he'd get it or not. And he kept every penny that he shot out. And they said he made quite a good business out of that. Okay, and it also started an archery craze among all the boys in town. And my sons, they went to the New Union School, which was the 2nd ward on the 1st floor, and the high school was on the 2nd floor. It stood where our city hall is nowadays. Some of these boys were little scamps. Once they painted a loop over the U on the Union School, so it would say Onion School. Another time, one of the druggist's sons took a supply of, I always get this wrong, I'm so sorry, asafoetida, which is a very fetid, rank-smelling drug that they used for breathing, throat, and digestion problems. And he dropped it down the grate so it would go right on the furnace. And once it melted, well, school was promptly dismissed for a couple days. It was just so bad. Okay, and the Indians that were camped in this area were the Sioux, the Chippewa, Kickapoo, Sauk, Fox, and the Ho-Chunk tribes. They utilized the natural sacred springs, which is in our current Swan City Park. Thank you for coming, and I have, if you're a little hungry, I have
I'm Maggie Kraeger, and together with my dear husband Henry, owned Kraeger's Market here in Sleepy Beaver Dam. Well, I'd like to tell you of an evening when it was a little sleepless. It was a night when a bunch of drunkards decided to shoot up the downtown. It was a cool, starlit evening on a May of 1865, about 11 p.m., and my clerks had gathered together with some of their friends in the shops above our store. They were singing and playing music and various instruments when along came a group of recently furloughed Civil War soldiers celebrating their survival drunkenly and riotously. They were making quite the racket, breaking boxes and barrels, and when they came to my shop, saw the lights on and heard the music. Well, they hollered up to my clerks and said, "Come down or we'll be shot." My clerks wisely ignored their taunts. That is, until they heard shots fired. Poor Mr. Minter was returning from a Good Templars meeting when he was fired upon. And when my clerks came down to see what was up, he almost shot off one of their heads. Now, mind you, I'm not quite sure how these boys managed to survive at the Civil War with such shoddy aim, because instead of my clerk's head, they got my sign. Well, they all hightailed it on out of there, but this being a small town and everybody knowing everybody, they were arrested the next day and fined $5 apiece. Now let me tell you, that was a lot of money in my day, and that taught them. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you.